Okay. Well, as I said before, Erev Tov, because I'm in Israel and it's 5 o'clock here. I know it's Boker Tov for everybody else. We are very, very excited to welcome Rabbi Zoe Klein. And if I can fangirl for a minute, I really enjoyed the short story book that we're going to be discussing today, and she'll tell us about some of her other endeavors. But I love Drawing in the Dust. Please take a look at the other books that Rabbi Klein has written. I just find them well, I'm going to say easy to read, which you can't say about every author, and interesting. And I can't wait for our conversation. However, I should probably share a little bit about Rabbi Klein. She is well, she'll tell us more what she does at Temple Isaiah. And she's been there since 2000. And she's the author of multiple novels, Drawing in the Dust, The Scroll of Anatia. And she has a beautiful insight into the world of biblical excavation in Israel. And that's in Drawing in the Dust. In addition to novels, Rabbi Klein has written articles for numerous publications, including Harper's Bazaar, Tikkun, and Torat Chaim. She has written chapters in a number of collections, including the Women's Torah Commentary. We have that at Makom. Teen Text and Holy Ground, A Gathering of Voices on Caring for Creation. Her poems and prayers are used in House of Prayer around the country. And of course, now this new book of stories. So without further ado, let's let Rabbi Zoe, get started. And then if we want to ask her some questions, we will. Oh, I didn't say the date. It's March 17th. Rabbi Zoe Klein, take it away.
Thank you, Vanessa. It's so great to be here virtually with all of you. And it was so meaningful, Vanessa, to see you in person at the ARGA conference in Memphis. And so it was so nice to be able to have that face-to-face time. And thank you so much for having me join your amazing book group. This looks like an incredible group. I would love to be part of this group. So I wanted to maybe start with, of course, my latest book is Candle, Feather, Wooden Spoon, which maybe you have, which is, I just want to say a little word about the title and then talk a little bit about the relationship between being a rabbi and being a writer. And we can go into some of the individual stories at some point. But the title of the book, Candle, Feather, Wooden Spoon, I don't know if anyone recognizes the ritual. It's not a well-known ritual, but if you came from a very traditional Jewish family, there's a little tradition that is right before Passover where you hide, once you've cleansed the whole house of any leavened material, any flour or bread, then the family hides 10 pieces of bread around the house, or 10 crackers, or 10 pieces of chametz, and they give the children a candle, a feather, and a wooden spoon. And the children are supposed to go around into all of the corners and look for the last pieces of bread. Some people don't, no one really knows exactly what they're supposed to represent. It's interesting, at that season, we have a lot of multicultural traditions around hiding and seeking. So an Easter, which is around the same time, you hide Easter eggs and the children find them. So traditionally, you find those last pieces of bread and you sweep them up with your little feather onto the wooden spoon. And then the 10 pieces of bread, the feathers, the spoons are all burned to signify that the house is ready for Passover. So the reason I titled the book that is because that's how I feel it is when you read fiction, or when you read stories. You're always looking for the treasure, for these little pearls of wisdom, these little moments of revelation in the text. And so I like to imagine that the reader goes into my writing with this candle, feather, wooden spoon, seeking out the meaning. And that connects to being a rabbi as well. So when I was, I'll just say a little bit about my background. When I was a child, I grew up in an artist's home. My father is a visual artist. In fact, there's a movie about one of his pieces called The Cardboard Bernini, which is on Netflix, and they're actually making another movie about him right now. So about a piece that he's working on called The Cathedral. So I grew up in this artist's home, a big, large studio, ballroom-sized studio filled with razor blades and sawdust flying and paper mache. And so I was always aware of work being created, of creativity and of process. I know a lot of writers. I know a lot of people who want to write memoirs, and a lot of people spend decades on this idea and never get to the end. One of the things my father taught me as an artist is the importance of process, but also the importance of finish. He said that his least favorite students were always the ones who would sign their canvas before it was finished, because that told him that they're really interested mostly in seeing their name. So one day when I was a child, I told my father, I really want to be a writer. And he said, I won't think of you as a writer until you finish a book. That sounds kind of harsh and mean, but it was not mean. It was a really important lesson. And I remember in college, when I finished my first novel, it was so exciting to go to him and to present it to him and for him to say, now you're a writer. For him, it wasn't about being published. It was just about being able to take an idea all the way to the end. So I grew up in this very creative world. And that's interestingly why I went into the rabbinate. And I thought that that would make sense to everybody. When people would say, why did you become a rabbi? I would say, because my father's an artist. And I thought that made sense. You know, Van Gogh was a minister. There's a real relationship between people who delve into the mystery of the world and want to understand the mystery of the world and storytelling. You know, the Torah is like a synchronized dream of an entire people that we spend time interpreting together. We share this story. We're part of this ongoing story. But I realized that not everybody came to the rabbinate out of the art world. However, being a writer, whenever I have people in my office coming for counseling, talking with me, I always listen the way an author would listen. I listen to your stories the same way you would read a story. So I try to find the chorus, the theme, the arc of the plot, the arc of character development. And I'll give you one example. I once had a woman come to my office who had recently had a double mastectomy, and she was having trouble loving her body. She said that whenever she looked at her body in the mirror, she just saw that it was, in her words, she felt deformed. She felt mutilated. And so I said to her, let's try to find a metaphor that helps you see yourself in a different way. And ultimately, we came up with the idea that her body is an altar and her breasts were the lambs that were offered up on the altar to the God of a bigger life. And many years later, she wrote to me and she said that she still thinks of herself as a sacred altar. And so I think that there's a very important relationship between writing and being a rabbi, is that you're helping people interpret their stories. Therapists will always say that we are unreliable narrators of our own stories. And so I've tried to bring that into my rabbinate, to be intrigued, curious, and in love with people's stories. Speaking of love, whenever people come into my office, when I've been a rabbi for 25 years now, and I do this little practice when someone comes to me, I think to myself first, this is somebody's beloved, even if they haven't met their beloved. I think this is someone's number one love. This is the person whose face someone wants to see on the pillow next to them every night for their whole lives. And no matter what their age is, no matter what they look like, anything about them, this is somebody's perfect match. And that's how I try to listen, is through that sense of recognizing someone as beloved. So Candle Feather Wooden Spoon is really special book to me. It's 22 short stories, and it's divided into 3 sections. And it's interesting because some people think of short stories. I know you read a lot of novels. You probably do you read nonfiction as well? Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
So some people on, this is our adult enrichment. I also
yes.
have a book group. I also put your book in the chat. So if
Mhm.
you want to see, and then I'll show a picture of it later. So this is a very, very elite congregation. So
Nice.
I'm going to say they read it all.
So I wanted to say that some people think of short stories as only for children, right? That you imagine that it's a children's collection. I want to say a little bit about, but it's not. It's really for anyone who can read. And the stories are really special. And I'll tell you the origin of them. So one or the idea of them. Once I went to the preschool class and I was supposed to tell a story. And I told the story, the famous story of the people in Helm who catch the moon in the barrel. So how many of you know that story? Or okay, well, it's a very, very famous, it's a famous story, one of the great Jewish classics. And the kids looked so bored and so annoyed. And I asked the teacher afterwards, like, why did they, that's such a good story. Why are they so annoyed? And the teacher said, because they heard it 3 times this week. And I realized, so the rabbis, we hadn't told each other what story we were bringing the kids. And I realized that it's so, we are the people of the book. We have so many stories, but we tend to recycle the same ones again and again. And I realized that I tell a lot of my own stories. Um, so I started to assemble stories that I've told. I started to put them into this collection of 22 stories, and I approached the CCAR press. And Rabbi Hera Person of the press said to me, "We love your writing. However, we don't publish fiction. You know, we publish books, educational books. We publish books on Judaism. We publish the Torah, the prayer book that you use. We don't do fiction." And I said, if you would permit me, I would love to make an argument as to why you should consider fiction. And she said yes. And so I wrote a proposal to the board of the CCR Press saying that as a rabbi, if I'm given a book of nonfiction, I might have 1 or 2 sermons or 1 class out of that book. But if I'm given a book of new short stories, not retellings, not modern retellings of old Jewish stories, but rather new stories, I will return to that book. That will be the most used book on my shelf because we are asked to tell stories all the time. And not only that, if you want to transfer values to people, if you want to talk about values, I believe that the best vehicle for that is fiction. If you think about, maybe some of you know the famous story of the rabbi who wants to teach someone a lesson on gossiping. And so he cuts open a feather pillow and the feathers go all over the town, right? I see some are familiar with that story. And the lesson is it's impossible to collect all the feathers. And so too, when you spread a rumor about someone, you can't ever bring it all back. Well, that's a fictional story. Or, you know, we can say a more secular version like The Boy Who Cried Wolf. There are these stories that carry lessons for us. Many young people learn more from Catcher in the Rye, let's say, than from a book on how to be a teenager. So there's something about fiction that unlocks our heart and gets inside of us in a deeper way than often than nonfiction. And so stories become a vehicle for history, for values, for ethics, for so much. So the book is divided into 3 sections. The first section is candle, and the candle section is a section that shines light on stories from our tradition. So they're all story. I'll give you one example from each section, perhaps. So the first section, candle, there's a story called Yophiel. Yophiel is a very esoteric angel in Jewish tradition. I once read a book on Jewish angelology and discovered Yophiel, and Yophiel is the keeper of the secrets of Torah. I always thought that was really interesting. So I imagined this little angel, Yophiel, who's fairly clumsy, and the archangels are trying to figure out what job to give him. And ultimately, they give him the job of being the keeper of the secrets of Torah, because they know that he's going to mess up. And that's the whole point. The whole point is that when you study Torah and you're getting close to mystery and these deep secrets, that you touch on them and you actually discover them. And it's because of Yophiel that he's not a really great keeper of the secrets. The second section, Feather, are modern stories that take flight. So stories, one story is the story Jew, which is relevant today in terms of thinking about anti-Semitism. It's a story of a boy who spray paints the word Jew in capital letters on the side of a classmate's family's business. And it's in red spray paint. And when this girl sees the word Jew, she's Jewish, it seems like such a menacing, terrible word. The J looks like a hook, and the E looks like claw marks, and the W looks like fangs. And it's terrifying. And they find the boy who does this, and they make him wash off the paint from the side of the building. And as he's washing it off, it's kind of a sci-fi story. He opens a magical portal, and he and the girl go in. And in this sort of video game like world, he has to confront the word Jew and learn what it actually means. That Jew actually in Hebrew means to be thankful. And he confronts Jewish history and learns. And by the time the story ends, the J has become a ladle, and the E is like a ladder, and the W is like the blessing from the priests, a blessing of peace. And so the whole word transforms. That second section are all modern stories, so they're not from biblical times. I want to just point out one more story from the candle section, the first section. A lot of times these stories came out of questions people would ask. So people often ask, why do you put a rock on the grave of someone that you're visiting? So there's a story called Shades and the Rock on the Grave. And it's about how when we're deeply grieving, we have a shade. The word shade in Hebrew means demon. But I also like that shade is like a shadow in English. So we have a shade that fastens itself to us. And it's a story of a woman who's trying to figure out how to remove the shades from a deeply grieving town. And ultimately what she ends up discovering is that they're memory stones. And I've always believed that the stone on the grave is to anchor the spirit of grief so that we don't walk the path of a mourner forever. So she discovers these memory stones that anchor down these shades. The final section, and then I'll open it up to any questions you have at all, is the spoon, wooden spoon. And that is a section that has stories that stir food for thought. They are stories that are maybe a little mystical. There's the final story in that section is called God Chooses a Genre. We often refer to God as the author of all life, but we never talk about what kind of author is God. Is this a comedy? Are we in the midst of a comedy? Are we in a horror story? Is this a drama? Is this a tragedy? Sometimes it truly feels like we're in a tragedy. Is it a romance? Or is it a mystery? What kind of story is it that we're in? And so that story examines that. So that's a lot of words for me, but I would love to hear if you have any questions or anything at all. I'm happy to talk about.
If you have a question, if you can raise your hand virtually, although I have the gallery view now. So, oh, wait, Susan, go ahead. Wait, I'm going to unmute you.
Oh, I thought I did.
There you go. There you go.
Thank you, Vanessa. I did read your book. As a matter of fact, I just finished it yesterday, and I was racing to finish it because I wanted to have read it by the time I heard you speak. So I do have a question for you, though. It seems to me that you were writing from a very feminist viewpoint and a gender neutral viewpoint. and which I do respect. And I just wonder if was that one of your purposes?
So, Susan, that's a great question and a great observation. So I'll give you a little secret into the writing process. So interestingly, well, I'll start with this. When I submitted the first version of the manuscript, and what Susan's referring to is that there are some male protagonist characters, there are female protagonist characters, there are couples who are there's one non-binary character, and there are a few homosexual couples, gay or lesbian couples. And so I'll tell you, when I first handed in the manuscript to the CCAR Press, it was being read and edited by millennials and Gen Zers. And so this is a book that's supposed to, go forth for future generations, right? It was not being edited by Gen X or boomers. It was so. What was interesting is what came back to me, the red line in the margin, every time, and this is kind of shocking, every time I had a boy helping a girl, every time I had a heteronormative couple, the note in the margin was gender normative. That word was over and over and over again. So the book that you see, Susan, and I have to say, it took me about 1.5 years to incorporate those comments, to sort of think about my own biases. I even fought for some things, like, for example, in the story Catching the Wind, which is about the origin of the Talit. And it's about these two girls at a marina. One of the girls' mother, it's very, a side mention, she sewed the curtains. Her mother had died, and she had sewn the curtains in their houseboat. And next to that was gender normative. So I fought for. I said, we don't have to switch every gender, right? There are still women who like to sew. It's not like now all men sew and all women are carpenters, right? Like, we can have a little bit. So that was really, but I learned a lot too. The story Shalom Bayit, which is actually one of my favorite stories in the collection, originally was, I used to use a lot of very romantic tropes, like kings and queens, princes, princesses, these kind of big grand stories with steeds and castles. And it was interesting to transform the message of those stories into a modern tale with modern characters wrestling with modern things. So what you're seeing was part of a learning process that I went through with the editing team.
I find that super fascinating.
It is so fascinating, yeah.
And quick anecdote: the story with the feathers. The traditional telling is that it's a male rabbi and it's a woman come in who's gossiping. And I know that I tell a lot of stories, and we usually switch up those genders. I also thought your story at the beginning, really, of you telling us that they had heard that same story 3 times, that's a watchword to our people. Come on, you got to communicate. What story are you telling? All right, great.
That's true.
Wait, I'm sorry, I'm never going to get that. So Evie has a great question. Is the reader the interpreter, and do you bring your own story into the interpreting?
So, one of the interesting things is there are a number of rabbis who try to write fiction, right? And some write wonderful fiction. And one of the difficulties when rabbis write fiction, I started as a fiction writer and then went into the rabbinate. So some go the other way. And sometimes what happens is there's a difficulty in trying not to preach, right? So if you're a preacher, you want your message to be clear. It's not the sermon is not usually up for interpretation. You want to, state what, you want people to walk away knowing what you said. It's not the same with stories, even novels. there has to be room for the reader to create a picture in their mind. All of the description that you're giving is actually born. It's like a revelation because it blooms in your mind, and therefore it's touched by your interpretation and your lived experience. And especially true with short stories. So with short stories, there's less of a turn radius. You can't spend so much time on description, right? So everything's done with lighter brush strokes, and you can't spend a lot of time on internal monologue. In Drawing in the Dust, I love the internal monologue. And so there's a lot of room for the reader to interpret. And that's where the magic happens. I think that's where you fall in love with stories, is where you see yourself in the story, or the story becomes yours. And my dream for Candle, Feather, Wood, and Spoon is that these stories belong to you, so educators, rabbis, parents, book groups, you could retell a story from this book around a campfire, but you don't have to read it word for word. You can tell it in your own words, and you can embellish it. Just like Vanessa was saying, the story of the feathers, she changes the rabbi to a female rabbi and just kind of modernizes it a little bit. I hope that's true with these stories. They're intended to be part of the canon of Jewish storytelling. So in terms of bringing myself into it, there are two stories in here that are based on truth. There's one story called Abraham's Return, which is a true story from my family. Just in a nutshell, it was my father, as you know, is an artist. And when he was in his 20s, he was commissioned by Barton's Candy in Brooklyn. I don't know if you remember Barton's Candy, to illustrate their Rosh Hashanah ad in the New York Times. And somebody fell in love with his woodcut, his print. And he was an art dealer from Europe, and came to him and said, give me 100 copies of this and I will sell it in Europe and send you the commission. Now, of course, this is a long before cell phones or computers. And that man took his artwork and my parents didn't hear from him again. And they felt really naive and taken advantage of. Well, almost 50 years later, one of his children, adult children, reached out to my father and said, we found 80 copies of your print. And they really were calling him because they wanted to know how much they were worth so they could sell them. And my parents said that your father actually stole those from us. And the children who were living in Switzerland were so horrified that they flew to New York from Europe, all three of them, to present the work back to my parents. And they said, we just want to right one of our father's wrongs. And it was just a really powerful story. So that's a true story. And there's another story called Pock-Faced Beauty, based on a true story. I officiated the funeral of an elderly woman who had pocks all over her, scars all over her face, and she actually, all over her body. And she actually had been a beautician. She had been a makeup artist to the stars in Hollywood. And her story is that when she was a baby, she had chicken pox, and she was bandaged up with her chicken pox. And this was in Ukraine. And there was a mob that gathered outside her family's village with knives and axes, and they were intending to murder the town. They were intending to start a pogrom. And her mother took her as a baby out to the mob. She ripped off the bandages and she said, smallpox, and the mob dispersed. And so it left her with all of these scars, but her scars saved over 1,000 people. And so that story of Pock-Faced Beauty really explores what is it that we mean by beauty, right? What is beauty? So there's some truth, but I'll just say one last thing. All stories, no matter how hard you try to make it fiction, it's all reflections. It's like our dreams. If you dream that you went to work, or you went down the street or to the store and you forgot to put your pants on, thankfully, that's not true. But it probably reflects a true anxiety that we have inside, right? So just like dreams, short stories do reflect our subconscious, our true subconscious.
Two fabulous stories. Alice, I'm going to get to you in a minute, but Bill Rosen, these are great questions. Do you ever get ideas for plot from your work as a rabbi, which is different, those two, and listening to people? That's number one.
Yes, absolutely, I do. I absolutely get ideas from listening to people and the questions people ask. Like I said about the stone on the grave, or why does matzah have holes? That led to one of the stories. I There are a number of stories that get inspired by listening to congregants, learning about relationships. One of the things I love about being a rabbi in one place for 24 years, a lot of my colleagues have moved around, is that, there are some relationships that didn't start out well. I might remind you of someone who you don't like. There might be things that I did, like I was walking quickly to the parking lot because I had a funeral and I didn't see you and didn't say hello to you. And so you're mad at me, or you don't like something I said about Israel, or I just like, someone named Zoe who you hate. But when you're in a place long enough, you get to work on these relationships. And some people, you have a fabulous relationship within a few weeks. And some people, it might take 15 years before you really have this deep connection. And so it's listening to people, but it's also studying the arc of relationships, which that's what stories are. No love story that you read starts out with people falling in love and nothing going wrong, right? Or else it wouldn't be a story. So just being immersed in a congregation of relationships also has guided a lot of the stories that I've written.
And his second question is, what is more difficult, writing a short story or writing a novel?
I would say that writing a novel is more difficult. Writing a novel can take many years. And what's interesting, when I wrote Drawing in the Dust, this is just a funny little example. When I started writing it, my character had a camera, and then she had a camera phone, and then she had an app on her phone. I mean, like just the type of camera over the course of the years that I wrote it, just kept changing. At one point, I had to incorporate 9/11 into the story because you couldn't ignore it. But then few years later, you could actually write a story without 9/11. So novels are hard because they take a long time, and you have to, the wonderful thing about publishing a novel is like, wow, after 10 years, I still like this story. You have to actually like the story for a really long time, feel like it's important and meaningful and good. And also novels are long, so there's a lot to remember, just there's so many characters, there's so much storyline. So the hard thing with a short story is the economy of space. And I really tried I was inspired in writing the short stories by songs. So if you think about a song that you love that tells a story. So there's so many songs that tell stories, popular songs. And when you really think about it, the stories are so important to us, but they are told with such an economy of words. And so I tried to think as a short story as songs and allow room for the reader to fill in the things that I couldn't fit in there. There's one story in here called The Goat Keeper that was originally a novel. So it was originally a 400-page novel. And so that was a hard story to condense down.
Alice, you need to unmute.
Anyway, thank you. This is a little bit narcissistic. I appreciate what you said because it helped me understand my own writing. 12 years ago, I published a novel. It's still on Amazon. It got a couple of good reviews, and it's a historical novel.
2 years ago, I wrote another historical novel, and it went nowhere. And I realized why. It is not current as far as the gender issues, and
Oh.
it is in the 50s, but it is the way it was in the 50s. And today's editors, after what you said, I realize don't want things the way they were. They want it the way they are.
Yeah,
So really,
well,
this was very helpful in a very unexpected way, besides appreciating what your writing is. Thank you for your
yeah,
interesting
no,
comments.
it's really interesting. And I know a lot of writers who are rethinking characters in their books because of the audience today.
Mhm.
I wrote a novel called Origin of Color that I think is a beautiful novel, and no one has seen it. It's not published. But it takes place in what was Swaziland, is now Eswati. I went to Africa to research this book. And it's about people with albinism. It's a novel, but there are people with albinism in Eswati and in Tanzania and other places where there's a belief that you can cure AIDS by having sex with someone who's albino. So it's a rough book. It's violent. There's also beautiful parts, but it's based on these true stories. But by the time I finished the book, our conversation about race, since George Floyd, is very different. And I can't imagine a book that's sort of a novel that explores skin color, Africa, written by a white Jewish woman. I feel like the only chance this book would have to see the light of day, and maybe it won't, and that's okay, would be if I partnered with another author or a couple of other authors and changed it. So it is interesting. I've also heard that so many movies and stories are coming out set in the 80s. And you might notice this, like TV shows and things, and you talked about your story in the 50s. And the reason is because that's before cell phones, and it's the last decade before cell phones. And it's when you write a modern story, it's very hard to have characters disappear because everybody can find each other. It's harder to write a mystery today when, it's we're so connected. So it is really, really interesting. Really interesting. Something this group would probably love. I was at the CCAR conference last week, and they had a session on the new translation that they're working on of Torah and new commentary. The Plout commentary that the Reform movement uses is 50 years old. Women's Torah commentary is great. But to have a multivocal commentary and translation, and to include voices, non-binary, different socioeconomics, different ethnic, different racial backgrounds, it's really fascinating. So that'll be something exciting to look at one day when it comes out. It's going to take some years.
Yeah, excuse me. As you were talking, before you mentioned it, I was wondering if you could make a screenplay out of that novel.
It's potentially it's something I'd like to revisit, because it was a beautiful story, but the times change. I have to say, I once went to a reading from a writer who was writing something about the disaster, the world disaster that the Mayans predicted. I think the Mayan calendar ended in 2012, and so people thought that in 2012 the world was going to fall apart. And it was like 2011 when I heard this reading, and he was desperate to get it published before 2012 because it wasn't the whole thing. And so, we're sort of, that's also the hard thing with writing, right? You're bound to the zeitgeist of the time.
One thing I very much appreciated, especially because I delve into these things a little bit deeper, is the questions at the end of each story. So can you just tell me, did you do that all on your own? Was it a collaboration? And I would just love to hear more about the editing process. we have a couple of book groups at Makom, and the short stories are concise, but some of the books that we have read, it's painful, they're too long. I can't assign a 500-page book that has grammatical errors in it.
Oh, no.
I mean, I just find that maybe I've made this up, but publishing houses, you know, they're not billionaires, and to make more money, they cut editors. So I'd love to hear more about the editing and the questions.
Yeah, so part of, because CCAR Press is really about education, I think that the questions were important for them to put out a fiction work that also could be used in teaching. You know, I love the idea of short stories for Shabbat, where people can get together on Shabbat, read a story, and then discuss it. So it's interesting. The questions, I worked on the questions at the end, and I thought that maybe ultimately we would have an educator come and write the questions from an educator perspective. But I wrote most of the questions. They had educators read them, and so some were changed, some were edited. But the questions are a wonderful invitation into conversation, and they transform the stories from an internal experience to one that builds relationship and community. So the questions are really designed not to deepen your understanding of the story, but to deepen your relationship with other people. So I'll just take and some of the questions are lighter and quicker. So questions like, what's your favorite food on Passover? I don't even know if that's in here, but something along those lines. And then deeper questions. There's one of the stories is called The Magic Word, and it's about a girl who, when she's little, she says, pass the macaroni, and her parents say, what's the magic word? And she says, abracadabra. She thinks that's the magic word. And then she learns the magic word in that context is please. But she becomes interested in magic words, and she becomes a linguist and studies words. Anyway, she goes to see a guru in Israel, in the mountains around Sfat and Meron. And after so much trekking and studying, she finally meets this guru. And the guru tells her that the magic word is, I don't know. and that's such a Jewish thing, to be able to say I don't know is the doorway to so much discovery and enchantment. So the questions at the end of that section, one of them is, what words have felt magical in your life in that saying or hearing them caused something to transform? So that can elicit stories that, it might have been a time you said yes to something, but it also could be a time you said no, and you found that power inside of yourself. But there are other questions like Eric Fromm wrote, creativity requires the courage to let go of certainties. Why does it require courage to let go of certainty? How might uncertainty lead to creation? So how is it that being able to say, I don't know, leads to the building of things? People often think saying I don't know means a weakness, but how does it contribute to a strength? So the questions, I think, like I said, they create community, and they take the stories out of just the private experience and hopefully inspire your stories to come up to the surface.
Yeah. Evie and then Lynn. Evie, unmute. Yeah, you're good. Go ahead.
I just find both your introduction to this as well, in terms of the stories, not being stuck in a period of time, as well as what you just described, so liberating, because I think even with our own traditions, we get stuck in the time that we were raised or knew. And an example that I could just give, because I just had this conversation with a friend just very recently about our Bar Mitzvah celebrations. you know, the way we saw them or remember or think we remember, maybe not accurately, as well as the judgments that we sometimes give in terms of what's happening now, and realizing that these things change in time, and we have to tell ourselves that it's okay to change. It's not a judgment on us or a judgment on somebody else, just the fluidity of being able to go lador vador, but not stuck in that one generation. So thank you for describing that so well.
Thank you. I love that you use the phrase lador vador, and we say that at each. I officiated a bat mitzvah yesterday, and you know we sing lador vador from generation to generation. And I used to think of it as kind of something that, like water running downhill, right? From the older generations to the younger. We're passing the Torah from the generations down to this 13-year-old. But I think that it is healthier if it is multi-directional, right? It's lador vador, meaning that the younger generation has something to teach us as well, right? We should constantly be curious and have a beginner's mind in approach. That's what we learn in Musar, you know, some ethical Jewish teachings. So I love that you talked about that.
That's really beautiful. Lynn.
Okay, I just want to say I haven't read your book yet. I put it on reserve and it's at the library right now. And I was really looking forward to getting it, but listening to you speak has been so inspirational for me. I just recently talked to a friend who talked to me about writing down memoirs about things that you can remember. And I came home and found something in my house that I looked at every day that came from my family that had a story behind it that I never even realized I had those stories. So I just want to tell you that just listening to you speak has been so inspirational for me. And I can't wait to read your book. And I really love what you said about telling stories, because I think that's how people remember things, just not from the past, but like you said, the values, and how important that is for all of us to have that piece of, and I never realized short stories, and I could maybe go there too. So
Yeah,
I'm
to give
inspired. I
yourself
just want to tell
permission,
you.
right? To give
Yes,
yourself permission
yes.
to tell short stories. And I once heard a writer say that you should write drunk and edit sober. So I pass that on, because a lot of times we write and we have the critic in our head. In fact, I haven't taught much writing, but I a couple of times I've been invited to teach a writing class. And the first session of the class, what I always do is I bring a paper shredder, like an old-fashioned paper. I bring a paper shredder,
Yeah.
and what I do is I have this is going to sound crazy, so just bear with me for a moment. But I did this in the rabbinical a rabbinical class. So I brought the paper shredder to class, and I said, I want to invite you to write about a sexual experience, and no one's ever going to read this. And the whole purpose of it is to become less afraid of the page. It's something my father does when he used to be the drawing professor at Pratt University for many years. And what he would do is he would start the class with a timer. He would set a timer on 60 seconds, and he would have the kids with their charcoal, and he'd say, you have to fill as much of the canvas as possible in 60 seconds. And the idea was to not be afraid of the canvas, you know. And we get scared because we imagine, like, what if my granddaughter reads this? Or so in this class, I had rabbinical students write about a sexual experience. First, they were really nervous, and they said, what's going to happen to the shredded pieces? As if I was going to be at home, like, putting them together. We can burn them, whatever you want. So they wrote, you know, like with a kind of writing these experiences, whatever they wrote.
Yeah.
And what was amazing is that in the end, the majority did not want to shred what they wrote. They wrote things they never thought that they could write, but once they wrote it, they realized that it was really meaningful. You know, or some of them talked about falling in love, or a really pivotal experience in their life, and how they understood themselves. So it takes courage to write, and
Yes.
it really does. So
I just want to remind
so well.
I want to remind everyone in the chat is where, now that's from Amazon if you want to get Rabbi Klein's book, or if you want to go to your local bookstore. And you are fabulous to listen to, but and you're not in competition with Makom, you're in California. So, but you know, if anyone's in Los Angeles, I would say go to her shul. And so you mentioned something about your dad, and I just want to make sure. Yep. And this is is this him? The card?
Yes. Yes.
It's so interesting, whatever this is.
Yes. So that is it's based on like a Bernini style fountain, but it is made out of cardboard. And so the intention of the piece was ultimately to let it sit outside until it fell apart, until
Wow.
it was destroyed. And you know, it came from there you could see it's kind of melting in that parting shot on the Chronogram magazine. Yeah. Yeah. So it was, in a way, it was his exploration of death, right? That he felt like he created artwork. It went wherever it went, where it went to someone's home, it went to a museum, it went nowhere. And ultimately, he wanted to own the end of the work as much as the beginning of the work. So that was, that is him.
I just found that super fascinating. And you know, growing up with an artist. And anything else? I love the short stories. I love drawing in the dust. How did you research? Obviously, drawing in the dust, which has a lot of archaeology and biblical characters, and you were a rabbi though when you wrote that, right?
Yes.
Yes. Because if you weren't a rabbi, that'd be a lot more research for most of us. I don't want to, you know, maybe, you know,
No, it was a lot of research. It was a lot of research. And you know, I also have this, when I wrote Drawing in the Dust, I don't do this quite as much anymore, but I like to imagine that I have, when I'm writing, that I have a boss. And the boss is kind of a mean boss. And the boss says things like, I'm not paying you to just sit here and think of character names. Name the character and move on. You know, meanwhile, you're not getting paid at all, and he doesn't exist. But I think that's you know, I need that kind of motivation. And so there were things that I made up in Drawing in the Dust while I was writing it, and did research afterwards. So I did a lot of research beforehand, and Alice knows, in terms of historical fiction, you have to do a lot of research for, you know, and I think a lot of Jewish authors, that's what we do. I mentioned Catcher in the Rye before. One of the things that fascinates me most about Catcher in the Rye is, oh God, he probably didn't have to do any research for this book. He's just writing about being like a teenager. Like how liberating. I did a lot of research, but at the end, I spoke to archaeologists. I had an archaeologist read the manuscript. But there were some funny things, like I didn't know what the tools were called that archaeologists use for little things. And so I had my character use dental tools, because I figured that's like the smallest tool I can imagine. And then I spoke to an archaeologist and said, what are the names of the tools? And he said, oh no, we do use dental tools.
Good job. Good job.
Found that right.
Yeah. Alice, and then I have the last question. Go ahead,
I just wanted to know, do you belong to a writers group?
I don't actually. I don't, but that's something I'm looking into.
It's a
doing
lot
more.
of fun.
Yeah.
Even when you get off topic.
Yes. I love writers. I do.
Well, I would be remiss if I didn't say, what are you working on next? And can you share that with us?
So great. I actually have, well, I have two manuscripts that are complete, like the Origin of Color that I mentioned, and another manuscript that's complete. And I haven't been a good mama to those books. You know, I completed them, and you know, my rabbi job is pretty all consuming. But I would like to just starting to work with someone to see if those books could be maybe given life, new life, or a life. And then I have this crazy project that I'm obsessed with. So I'm going to share it with you. And if you think I'm crazy, that's fine. But it's not even about necessarily publication. It's something for my soul. But I've always loved the Noah's Ark story. And I've had this fantasy of building Noah's Ark out of poetry and basically writing one poem for every species of mammal on Earth.
Wow.
And so I started, doing research, finding lists of mammals, ordering books. And what I learned is that you're going to be shocked. A quarter of all mammals are bats.
Ew.
I know. I mean, you wouldn't think. So I thought, writing poems about zebras or giraffes or dogs or cats, that's one thing. But writing 1,600 bat poems seemed kind of crazy. So I thought to myself, if I can write bats, if I can do bats, then I could build the rest of the ark, but I have to conquer bats. And so I've written 500 bat poems. I'm only a third of the way through the bats. But the reason why it's special and meaningful to me is I love the writing process. I love writing poetry and finding that perfect stanza or rhyme or image. And when you're writing about different species, like if there's a rare bat species that lives only in the caves of Borneo, then you have to research Borneo and the climate and the fauna. And it's almost like travel. You're traveling to different parts of the world and spending time with these different types of creatures. And writing and reading are travel. They actually say that what happens in your brain when you're reading is the same as what happens when you're getting perspective from a new place, when you go to a new place. So the writing and the reading, they're literal journeys if you're just looking at our brains. So that's one of my fun projects. It's not Jewish. But it is something I'm enjoying.
Well,
We'll see where it goes.
we're gonna take a look at that. That's a lot of bat poems. That's all
You
I'm
don't have
gonna
to read them
say.
all, don't worry.
Right. Alice?
Yeah, why not write it as a children's alphabet book with the
Yeah.
animals as the poems?
Yeah, I mean that's also a really good idea. This is like a 10-year project for me. This is something that it will take a long time, and it's almost meditative.
Yeah.
And also to me it's urgent. In not urgent in that I'll write it quickly, but that a lot of these species are disappearing. And so I actually wanted to give each one its honor with a real thought out poem.
And if I may also add, it's very hard to get poetry published. I have a manuscript of poems that's sitting there, and I do have poems that appear on the Highland Park Poetry Organization site. But for the most part, it's hard to publish a book of poetry.
Oh, yes. And that's actually why I said it's not, for me, that's not necessarily about publication. But I could imagine, if you know what crowdsourcing is, I could imagine once I finish, I could crowdsource through the web to artists around the world to illustrate each poem and then create an arc that's not only a Noah's Ark of poetry, but a Noah's Ark of images and pictures. So it could be an experience rather than necessarily a published volume. But just to show you how far I went with it, Vanessa,
Yeah.
I had a sabbatical last year. And I took a month of my sabbatical and I rented a cabin in Tennessee to write, just to be alone and write. And it was very special. My husband was very supportive. But I'm going to show you on the screen what the cabin looked like. So this was the cabin. It's an art.
Oh, okay. Well, there's your muse, your inspiration.
It was very nice. Anyway.
That's hilarious.
Yeah.
Our hour's at an end. I want to thank Rabbi Klein for being with us. A quick reminder, we're going to look at some of the stories more in depth on Thursday night, March 28th, when I'm back from Israel. And there's, watch your Makom at home, which comes on Thursday now. There's a lot of great things going on at synagogue. In fact, a week from last night will be our Purim spiel. And I think you can still sign up for that. And there's just a lot of fun things going on. It's so important. And you'll be hearing from me about Israel when I get home from Israel. I wish you, Rabbi Klein, Nisiya Tova, good travels. And it's great seeing everyone. It's so great to do this. I'm here, you're in Chicago, and Rabbi Klein's in California. It doesn't get any better than that. So,
The whole world.
thanks. All right, we'll see
you.
everybody.
Safe travels to you.
Thanks,
safe.
thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.